Danielle Reed was no stranger to walking into rooms where she was underestimated. Her quiet strength had carried her through a lifetime of challenges. But on this particular morning, at a busy airport terminal, she was about to face an all-too-familiar test. What began as a simple request for a first-class upgrade quickly unraveled into an encounter that revealed deep-seated assumptions and quiet arrogance. Two employees, certain they knew who Danielle was just by looking at her, mocked her without hesitation. But what they did not know, what they could not have known, was that Danielle Reed was not a woman who could be dismissed so easily. What followed was a moment of reckoning, one that would ripple far beyond the terminal. As Danielle navigated this experience with calm precision, unexpected events unfolded. A phone call that carried the weight of change, a young woman whose life was on the brink of transformation, and small acts of kindness that proved how far grace and resilience could reach. But this story is about more than just what happened at an airport counter. It is about the strength to face adversity with dignity, the power of compassion to create ripples of change, and the quiet victories that remind us who we are and what we stand for. How did Danielle turn mockery into a lesson no one would forget? Who reached out to her in unexpected ways? And how did her actions inspire change in places she never expected? Danielle Reed stood quietly in line at the Hartford International Airport, surrounded by the hum of busy travelers, rolling luggage, and overlapping conversations. The air felt heavy with the scent of freshly brewed coffee from nearby kiosks and the faint whir of the departure board flickering overhead. Danielle, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray blazer, cream blouse, and simple pearl earrings, blended seamlessly into the flow of the airport crowd. Her small, black leather carry-on bag rested at her feet, its handle gripped firmly in her hand. On the outside, she appeared calm, composed, even, but inside, exhaustion rippled through her body, leaving her feeling hollow. The past week had been relentless. Back-to-back meetings, late nights, and early mornings. She was no stranger to this pace. Years of climbing the corporate ladder had taught her to endure long days and short nights. But today, something felt heavier than usual. Danielle glanced at her watch. Her flight to Chicago was still an hour away. Plenty of time. She inhaled deeply, feeling the rhythm of her breath steady her thoughts, and approached the service desk with a polite smile. Behind the counter were two employees, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair named Samantha Banks, and a tall, wiry man named Kevin Roberts. Samantha sat perched on her stool, twirling a pen absent-mindedly as she stared at the computer screen. Kevin leaned against the counter, typing slowly with a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Neither looked up as Danielle approached. "Good afternoon," Danielle began softly, her voice even and professional. "I would like to ask if there are any first-class upgrades available for Flight 402 to Chicago." Samantha glanced up, her expression one of immediate disinterest. The briefest flicker of judgment passed through her eyes, so fleeting that someone less observant might have missed it. But Danielle saw it, felt it. Years of enduring subtle slights had trained her to recognize them in an instant. "First-class upgrades?" Samantha repeated, her voice carrying a tone of disbelief. She glanced at Kevin, her lips twitching into something close to a smirk. "They're not cheap, ma'am. You sure about that?" Danielle's brow arched slightly, though her expression remained composed. She had heard this before too many times, in too many forms. A quiet dismissal wrapped in false courtesy. "I understand the cost," Danielle replied, her tone steady. "I just need to know if any are available." Kevin leaned in, lowering his voice, though his words carried the same condescension. "Upgrades are for special customers. High demand, you know. It's not for everyone." The words were sharp, coated in a smugness that stung more than Danielle wanted to admit. Her grip on her carry-on tightened slightly, her knuckles paling against the handle. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the same familiar frustration that came when someone saw her and assumed less. Behind her, the line of passengers grew restless. A few exchanged glances, sensing the tension. The man directly behind her shifted uncomfortably, his frown deepening as he observed the scene. Danielle inhaled slowly through her nose, her father's voice echoing in her mind. Grace and persistence will take you farther than anger ever will. She straightened her posture, calm and unbothered, as though their words had not touched her at all. "I did not ask for your opinion," she said softly, her voice like a blade wrapped in silk. "I asked about availability." The shift in the air was immediate. Samantha's smirk faltered slightly, and Kevin's fingers froze mid-tap on the keyboard. The confidence in their mockery wavered as Danielle's steady gaze held theirs. Behind her, the whispers of other passengers began to swell, a woman murmuring to her partner, a man clearing his throat in disapproval. Kevin recovered first, though his tone had lost its earlier smugness. "Let me check," he muttered, tapping a few keys on the keyboard. But even as he looked, he turned to Samantha with an exaggerated sigh, his voice just loud enough for Danielle to hear. "People always reaching a little too high, huh?" Samantha snorted quietly in response, the sound cutting through Danielle's resolve like a splinter. "You people." The phrase was not spoken aloud, but its weight lingered in their every glance, their every dismissive word. Danielle's jaw tightened as the sting settled into her chest. It was the same sting she had felt as a child when classmates whispered about her at lunch, the same sting she had felt as a young woman walking into boardrooms filled with skeptical stares. But Danielle Reed had not come this far to let their assumptions define her. With deliberate calm, she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her phone. Her actions were smooth, practiced, almost as though she had been here before. She dialed a number and pressed the phone to her ear, her voice carrying a quiet authority as she spoke. "Hello, this is Danielle Reed," she said, her words clear and unhurried. "Can you send Mr. Ethan Lewis down here, please? We have a personnel issue that needs to be addressed." Kevin froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Samantha's pen stopped mid-twirl as her wide eyes flicked to Danielle. The laughter and mockery they had worn so comfortably moments before slipped away, replaced by unease. Kevin tried to recover. "Pulling out the big names, huh? Who's Mr. Lewis, your cousin?" His chuckle was hollow now, his bravado cracking at the edges. Samantha shifted uncomfortably, glancing nervously at the line of passengers, now watching them openly. Danielle said nothing. She tucked her phone back in her pocket and stepped to the side, her expression calm but unreadable. Inwardly, her thoughts churned. She had learned long ago that some lessons needed to be taught not for revenge, but for growth. 10 minutes. That was all it would take. She stood in silence, the faintest hint of a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth as the seconds ticked by. Around her, the energy of the terminal had shifted. Passengers whispered amongst themselves, their curiosity growing. A silver-haired woman near the back of the line shook her head in disapproval, her narrowed gaze fixed on the employees. The man behind Danielle stepped forward slightly, his quiet voice breaking the silence. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly, his eyes warm with concern. "Is everything all right?" Danielle turned to him and offered a small, polite smile. "Thank you," she replied gently. "It will be handled shortly." The man nodded once, his gaze lingering on Samantha and Kevin before he stepped back into the crowd. Danielle appreciated his quiet support, a subtle kindness that reminded her not everyone in the world assumed the worst. As the minutes passed, the unease at the counter grew more visible. Kevin tapped his fingers anxiously on the desk, while Samantha checked the time on her phone. Neither of them spoke. They had expected Danielle to give up, to walk away, embarrassed and defeated. But she had not. The sound of polished shoes clicking against the terminal floor broke the silence. Heads turned as a tall man in a navy suit approached with purposeful strides. His name badge read Ethan Lewis, and his expression was serious, his gaze sharp as it swept over the scene. Samantha's face drained of color. Kevin straightened up abruptly, as though his posture might erase the last 10 minutes of his behavior. "Mr. Lewis," Samantha stammered, her voice trembling slightly. "What are you doing here?" Ethan ignored her. Instead, he turned to Danielle with a look of genuine respect. "Ms. Reed," he said firmly, dipping his head slightly. "I came as quickly as I could. I apologize for the delay." The hush that fell over the terminal was deafening. Samantha's mouth hung open, her earlier arrogance replaced with disbelief. Kevin looked as though the ground had disappeared beneath him. Danielle turned to face Ethan and nodded calmly. "Thank you for coming," she replied, her voice steady. "I believe we have a situation with the staff here." Ethan's gaze shifted to Samantha and Kevin, his expression darkening as realization dawned. His voice, when he spoke, was clipped and furious. "Is this true? Did you mock a paying customer and fail to provide basic professionalism?" Neither employee answered. Their silence said everything. Danielle stood quietly, watching the scene unfold. She felt no satisfaction in their humiliation, only a quiet sense of justice. Ethan turned back to Danielle. "On behalf of the airline, I offer my deepest apologies," he said. "I will handle this immediately." Danielle nodded once, her calm demeanor unshaken. She picked up her carry-on and turned to follow Ethan toward the gate, leaving the stunned employees and the murmurs of the crowd behind. In her mind, one thought lingered. 10 minutes. Sometimes that was all it took to change everything. Danielle walked alongside Ethan Lewis as they moved toward the gate, her steps steady, each click of her polished heels echoing faintly on the tile floor. Around her, the hum of airport life continued, announcements overhead, conversations blending into one low murmur, but she could feel the shift. The glances from other passengers lingered longer now, their curiosity sharper. They had witnessed something unusual. The moment assumptions unraveled, leaving uncomfortable truths behind. Ethan, the airline's regional manager, was a tall man with salt and pepper hair, his posture reflecting years of authority. He moved briskly, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the terminal as if searching for the smallest sign of disorder. Danielle had dealt with men like Ethan before, professionals who carried themselves like pillars of their organization. Yet, there was something more here, a genuine concern that softened the otherwise rigid edges of his demeanor. "I cannot apologize enough for what happened back there, Ms. Reed," Ethan said as they paused at the gate counter. "It's inexcusable. This is not how we treat customers ever." Danielle inclined her head slightly, offering a small, controlled smile. "I appreciate your apology, Mr. Lewis, though I believe the situation speaks for itself." Ethan nodded, his gaze flickering back toward the counter they had left behind. He didn't need to look far to see the aftermath of what had unfolded. Samantha and Kevin were still there, though they seemed smaller now. Their earlier smugness had drained entirely, replaced by slumped shoulders and faces pale with discomfort. The line of passengers they had once dismissed now stared openly, their expressions a mix of judgment and quiet satisfaction. "Would you mind waiting here for a moment, Ms. Reed?" Ethan asked, his voice gentler now. "I need to handle this personally." Danielle gave a small nod, stepping to the side. She watched as Ethan turned and made his way back toward the service counter, his presence commanding. "Ms. Banks, Mr. Roberts," Ethan began, his voice low but firm. "Would you care to explain your behavior?" Though Danielle could not hear their full responses, she saw the way Samantha fumbled for words, her face flushing deeper with each passing second. Kevin looked as though he wanted to disappear entirely, his hands twisting awkwardly as he struggled to meet Ethan's gaze. Ethan listened for a moment, his head shaking slightly, before he raised a hand to cut them off. "This will not stand," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "You both know better." Ethan's tone was not cruel, but it was cutting, sharp with authority and disappointment. Danielle could almost feel the weight of it from where she stood. Turning her attention away, Danielle focused on the rows of seats near the gate. People were still watching her, though now their gazes carried something closer to admiration. A woman with silver hair gave Danielle a small, approving nod. A man in a gray suit, who had earlier offered quiet support, gave her a look of respect as if to say, "I knew you were more than they thought." Danielle turned back toward the windows, gazing out at the vast expanse of tarmac. Planes dotted the runways, sleek and still, preparing for takeoff. For a moment, the world outside the glass seemed impossibly calm compared to the storm she had just weathered. But storms, Danielle thought, were nothing new to her. She thought back to her early years, walking into offices where no one expected her to succeed. How they had underestimated her quiet demeanor and doubted her ability before she ever spoke a word. It had always been the same dance: suspicion first, then shock, and eventually respect. But Danielle had stopped waiting for others to see her worth a long time ago. Her father's words returned to her as they often did. "You carry your dignity with you. No one can take it unless you hand it over." A sound broke through her thoughts. Ethan had returned. He approached with that same brisk stride, though his expression now was softer, less guarded. "Ms. Reed," he said, dipping his head respectfully. "Thank you for your patience. I have addressed the matter." Danielle turned to face him fully, her gaze steady. "I trust it will not happen again." "It will not," Ethan assured her, his tone firm. "The employees in question will be escorted to HR, and further action will be taken. I also want to personally ensure your comfort on this flight. Your upgrade has been processed." Ethan gestured toward the gate attendant, who smiled nervously and handed Danielle a freshly printed first-class boarding pass. She took it with a small nod, her composure unbroken. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis," Danielle said simply, tucking the pass into the small leather bag she carried. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "May I say something, Ms. Reed?" Danielle raised a brow slightly, indicating for him to continue. "What you did back there, the way you handled it, was impressive," he said, his voice quiet but genuine. "It is not easy to face that kind of treatment and respond with such dignity." Danielle regarded him for a moment before responding. "Years of experience, Mr. Lewis." Her tone carried no bitterness, only a quiet strength. "It is easier to stand steady when you know exactly who you are." Ethan nodded, his respect for her clear. "Safe travels, Ms. Reed." With that, Danielle turned toward the gate, her steps measured as she handed her boarding pass to the attendant. As she walked down the jet bridge, the air around her shifted again. The tension she had carried from the counter began to lift, little by little, like the weight of a heavy coat being removed. Once aboard the plane, Danielle was greeted by a flight attendant with a crisp Navy uniform and a warm, professional smile. "Good afternoon, Ms. Reed," the woman said gently. "Welcome to first class. May I show you to your seat?" Danielle nodded. "Thank you." The flight attendant guided her to seat 1A, a plush leather chair by the window. The cabin smelled faintly of fresh linen and coffee, and a soft, golden light bathed the space. It felt a world apart from the chaos of the terminal. As Danielle settled into the seat, she allowed herself to exhale fully for the first time all morning. The weight of Samantha and Kevin's words still lingered in the back of her mind, like a faint echo, but she did not let it consume her. She had long ago learned how to carry that weight without letting it break her. The flight attendant returned moments later, holding a small crystal glass of sparkling water. "For you, Ms. Reed. Is there anything else I can bring you?" Danielle shook her head, offering a small smile. "No, thank you. This is perfect." As the flight attendant disappeared toward the front of the cabin, Danielle sipped the cool water, feeling its refreshing clarity wash away the remnants of the morning's tension. Out of the corner of her eye, Danielle caught a movement a few rows away. An older gentleman, silver-haired, and wearing a pressed navy suit, offered her a quiet nod of recognition. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no judgment, just understanding. Danielle returned the nod, a small moment of connection passing between them. Settling back in her seat, Danielle reached for her carry-on, pulling out her father's journal. Its worn leather cover felt familiar and grounding in her hands. She opened it carefully to a blank page, clicked her pen softly, and paused. For a moment, she simply stared at the white space before her, letting the silence of the cabin and the distant hum of the engines surround her. Then, she began to write. "Today, they underestimated me again, but I stood steady. Quiet power is still power." The words flowed easily, her thoughts finally free. Outside the window, the plane's engines rumbled softly as it prepared for takeoff. Danielle stared at the tarmac below, watching as the world outside began to move, fast and steady. She knew the climb was coming, the forceful push into the sky, the sound of acceleration. It reminded her of life, chaotic yet controlled. And as always, Danielle Reed was ready. As the plane's engines rumbled to life, Danielle Reed felt the subtle jolt of motion. The runway stretched long and infinite outside her window, the terminal fading in the distance. The cabin hummed with quiet anticipation as the aircraft tilted forward, gathering speed. Danielle's fingers brushed against the edge of her father's journal, still resting on her lap. For a moment, she simply watched the world blur past as the plane climbed higher and higher, the earth shrinking below. The ascent, much like her life, felt steady but full of unseen turbulence. Yet, Danielle had always held firm, gripping tightly to the values her father had instilled in her: grace, persistence, and quiet strength. As the plane leveled at cruising altitude, the hum of the engine softened, and the quiet calm of the first-class cabin settled around her like a blanket. She let out a slow breath, leaning her head back against the leather seat. For the first time all morning, she felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. The flight attendant from earlier, Molly Grant, appeared at Danielle's side with a soft smile. She was young, no older than 25, with warm brown eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately put passengers at ease. Molly held a linen-covered tray in her hands, a small crystal glass of orange juice balanced on top. "Ms. Reed," she said kindly, her voice soft so as not to disturb the other passengers, "I thought you might enjoy a little refreshment." Danielle looked up surprised. "I did not ask for this." "You did not have to," Molly replied with a gentle smile, setting the glass down on the armrest table. "It has been a long morning for you, I am sure." Something in Molly's voice caught Danielle's attention. It was not pity, not judgment, just quiet kindness. It felt so different from the smirking arrogance she had endured earlier. Danielle studied Molly for a moment, her gaze softening. "Thank you," she said finally, her tone genuine. Molly's smile brightened just slightly. "You are welcome. If you need anything else, just let me know." As Molly turned to assist another passenger, Danielle picked up the glass, letting the cool condensation on its surface ground her. The unexpected gesture lingered in her thoughts longer than she expected. It was not the drink itself that mattered. It was the effort, the care. Danielle had spent years fighting to be seen and treated with respect, so when kindness appeared small and unspoken, it stayed with her. She sipped the juice slowly, glancing around the cabin. Across the aisle sat an older woman with neatly styled gray hair, reading a paperback novel. Her expression was serene, her hands moving over the pages with a practiced ease. 2 rows ahead, a young couple whispered quietly to one another, the woman resting her head on her partner's shoulder as they laughed softly about something Danielle could not hear. And then there was the man in the Navy suit, the one who had nodded to her earlier. Now, he sat calmly with his reading glasses perched low on his nose, a business magazine spread open in front of him. He seemed to sense her gaze because he looked up and smiled faintly. Danielle returned it politely, noting the kindness in his eyes, another small, silent acknowledgement. It was in these quiet moments that Danielle often found herself reflecting on the ways people moved through the world. She had spent her life in rooms where she was either overlooked or underestimated, but she had also learned to notice what others missed. The quiet gestures, the fleeting smiles, the weight carried in a stranger's eyes. These were the things that revealed the truth about people, not their words, but their actions. She turned back to her journal, uncapping her pen. Her father's voice echoed in her thoughts once more. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet and unshakable. Just as she began to write, a soft voice broke through her focus. "Excuse me, ma'am." Danielle looked up to see the man in the Navy suit leaning slightly toward her aisle. He appeared to be in his mid-60s, with a kind, weathered face and sharp blue eyes. "I hope I am not disturbing you," he said softly, "but I felt I should say something." Danielle arched a brow faintly, setting her pen down. "Go on." The man smiled, though it was small and serious. "I saw what happened back at the terminal," he admitted, his voice low enough to remain private. "The way those employees treated you." Danielle's expression remained neutral, though she could feel a faint wave of discomfort stir within her. "And what did you see?" "I saw a woman who carried herself with more dignity than most people ever learn," the man said simply. "You handled it well. I admire that." Danielle hesitated, unsure how to respond. She was used to people staring after the fact, judging, whispering, sometimes pitying. But admiration was not something she encountered often. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice calm. The man nodded, his eyes crinkling faintly with sincerity. My wife was like you, he continued, his tone softening. Quiet, strong. She taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand your ground with grace. Danielle's gaze softened. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, he agreed, leaning back slightly into his seat. I just thought you should know someone noticed. Danielle nodded once, offering him a small but genuine smile. I appreciate that. As the man turned his attention back to his magazine, Danielle sat still for a moment, her thoughts unsettled in a way she could not quite explain. It was not that she needed validation, she had long ago stopped looking for it in others, but something about his words stayed with her. Someone noticed. How often did people notice? How often did someone stop long enough to acknowledge the quiet strength it took to stand firm, to hold your composure, to respond with dignity when the world gave you every reason not to? Danielle glanced toward the flight attendant, Molly, who was now assisting the older woman with her reading light. Molly's kind smile remained ever present, her movements attentive but unassuming. It does not take much, Danielle thought, but even small gestures matter. She picked up her pen again and wrote a single line in her journal. Kindness, no matter how small, creates ripples. The words felt true as she wrote them. Perhaps the morning's events had left her more reflective than usual, but she could not shake the feeling that something larger was at play. First Samantha and Kevin, now Molly and the man in the navy suit. People could tear others down so quickly, but they could also lift them up sometimes without even realizing it. As the flight continued, Danielle allowed herself to relax. The hum of the engines became a lullaby of sorts, the first-class cabin a bubble of quiet. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the tension of the day begin to slip further away. Her father's journal still rested in her lap, its presence grounding her as it always did. She thought of him, his strong hands, his steady voice, the way he had always told her to keep moving forward, no matter how hard the climb felt. The man's words echoed again in her mind. Someone noticed. And for the first time in a while, Danielle let herself believe it. The steady hum of the engines filled the first-class cabin like a soft, unending melody. Danielle Reed sat quietly in seat 1A, her father's leather journal resting open on the tray table before her. The words she had written earlier, kindness, no matter how small, creates ripples, stared back at her, etched into the smooth cream of the page. Outside her window, the clouds rolled by like fields of untouched snow, soft and endless. The horizon stretched far and wide, kissed faintly by the golden glow of the sun. A peaceful stillness surrounded her, so different from the chaos of the terminal earlier that morning. Danielle turned the pages of her journal slowly, the familiar scratch of her fingertips against the worn leather grounding her. She had carried this journal with her for years, a gift from her father before he passed away. It was more than a notebook. It was a lifeline, a quiet confidant that had witnessed her moments of triumph and her struggles. Her eyes fell on a page written year earlier, the date carefully scrawled in the top corner. June 18th, 2003. You are stronger than you think, Dad told me today. The world will test you. It will try to make you smaller than you are. But you will not let it. You will hold your head high, always. Danielle felt her chest tighten faintly as the memory surfaced. She could almost hear her father's voice, deep, steady, and sure. He had been her greatest champion, her loudest cheerleader in a world that often tried to silence her. She closed her eyes, letting the memory take her back to a sweltering summer afternoon in her hometown of Macon, Georgia. She had been 16, standing on the porch of their small, white-clapboard house, tears stinging her eyes after a particularly cruel day at school. Her father, a tall man with a sturdy frame and gentle eyes, had found her there. He had not asked what had happened. He had always known when something was wrong. Instead, he placed his strong, calloused hand on her shoulder and said the words she had never forgotten. The world will test you, but you will not let it break you. Those words had carried her through countless battles since small wars waged in boardrooms, offices, and airports just like the one this morning. They had reminded her, over and over, that her worth was not defined by others' assumptions. Danielle opened her eyes slowly, feeling the weight of that memory settle in her chest. She glanced down at the journal once more, tracing the faded ink of her father's handwriting on the inside cover. Grace is strength, and strength is grace. Use both, and the world will bend when it refuses to see you. His words had been a gift, a lesson she had spent a lifetime learning. The soft click of footsteps drew Danielle's attention back to the present. She looked up to see Molly, the young flight attendant, approaching her row again. Molly held a small white porcelain cup in her hands, steam rising gently from the surface. "Ms. Reed," Molly said softly, her voice calm and polite, "I thought you might enjoy some tea. I brought chamomile, it is calming." Danielle blinked, taken aback by the thoughtful gesture. "You have been very kind to me today," she said, studying Molly's face for a moment. Molly smiled faintly as she set the cup down on Danielle's tray. "Sometimes people need a little extra kindness," she replied simply, "especially on days like today." Her words settled over Danielle like a warm blanket. There was something about Molly, her gentle nature, her quiet attentiveness that struck Danielle deeply. It reminded her of someone else, someone she had not thought of in years. "Where are you from, Molly?" Danielle asked after a moment, her voice softer now. Molly's smile brightened just slightly. "Raleigh, North Carolina," she said. "My mom raised me and my 3 brothers there. She used to say the same thing your father did about kindness. Even when people are unkind to you, she would tell us, you show them how to be better." Danielle felt a pang in her chest, something between sorrow and gratitude. You show them how to be better. How many times had her father said something similar to her when she was young? "I think your mother was a wise woman," Danielle said, her voice thoughtful. Molly dipped her head modestly. "She was. I try to remember her words when I meet difficult people." Danielle studied the young woman for a moment longer. Molly's kindness had been simple, offering tea, a quiet word, but it had been enough to touch her deeply. Perhaps it was because kindness, genuine and unassuming, had been so rare for Danielle in her life. As Molly moved on to assist another passenger, Danielle sat back in her seat, wrapping her hands around the warm porcelain cup. The tea's aroma, earthy and soothing, filled her senses, calming her in ways she had not expected. She thought back to the earlier scene in the terminal, to Samantha and Kevin's cutting words. There had been no kindness in their actions, no willingness to see beyond their assumptions. Yet here, now, someone as young as Molly had reminded her that there were still people in the world who chose compassion over judgment. Danielle's thoughts drifted further back, to her early days as a young professional. Fresh out of college, she had walked into her first corporate office, eager but naive. The skepticism she had faced had been immediate. Her soft voice and quiet demeanor had led people to dismiss her as fragile or unprepared. But Danielle had proved them wrong, one day at a time. One memory stood out in particular: her first mentor, Sarah Lindstrom, a senior manager with a reputation for being as tough as she was brilliant. Sarah had seen something in Danielle that no one else had: potential. On her second week at the company, Sarah had pulled Danielle aside after a meeting. "You are quiet, Danielle," Sarah had said. "But quiet does not mean weak. Quiet often means listening, learning, and choosing your words carefully. Use that. It is a strength, not a flaw." Those words had been another lifeline, one that had carried Danielle through years of climbing the ladder. Sarah's belief in her had been a turning point, one she had never forgotten. Kindness had always been a thread running through Danielle's life, sometimes loud, but often quiet and unexpected. And it had shaped her into the woman she was today. The plane jolted slightly as it passed through a patch of turbulence, pulling Danielle back into the present. She set the cup of tea back on the tray, her thoughts quieter now. Outside the window, the clouds still stretched far and wide, untouchable in their vastness. Reaching for her pen, Danielle turned to a fresh page in her journal. She wrote slowly, deliberately, the words flowing easily. "The world will always test you, but there is strength in stillness. The kind word of a stranger, the belief of a mentor, these are the ripples that carry us forward." She paused, letting the words settle on the page. Danielle thought of Molly, of Sarah, of her father, people who had chosen kindness, even when they did not have to. And in doing so, They had created ripples of change that carried far beyond what they could see. Danielle knew that she, too, had that power. The hum of the engines lulled her into a quiet calm. She closed the journal gently, resting it on her lap, and turned her gaze back to the window. The sun had risen higher now, spilling light across the clouds in soft streaks of gold. For the first time all day, Danielle allowed herself to smile. The sun outside Danielle's window had climbed higher, casting soft golden light into the first-class cabin. The hum of the engines remained steady, an almost meditative sound that filled the quiet space. She sat back in her seat, her father's journal resting securely in her bag now, its comforting presence a weight she always carried. Danielle allowed herself to breathe deeply, to take in the stillness that contrasted sharply with the turbulence of the morning. A soft rustling sound broke her focus. Turning her head slightly, Danielle noticed movement a few rows ahead. A woman in row 3 was fumbling with her belongings, a heavy coat, a crumpled plastic bag, and a few children's toys spilling out onto the aisle. Her expression was tense, her shoulders tight as she tried to organize the chaos at her seat while keeping a watchful eye on the toddler in her lap. The little boy squirmed, restless from the long flight, his small legs kicking lightly against the seat in front of him. His cries were soft at first, small whimpers of frustration, but they quickly grew louder, filling the otherwise peaceful cabin. Passengers began to turn their heads, some with mild curiosity, others with visible annoyance. Danielle watched quietly, her expression neutral but thoughtful. The woman in row 3, early 30s, with dark curls pinned hastily back, looked overwhelmed. She rocked the boy gently, whispering calming words that were met with louder cries. Her frustration was clear, not just in the way she moved, but in the quiet desperation on her face. Danielle had seen this look before. It was the same look her mother had worn many years ago, standing at the kitchen counter after a long day of work, trying to balance bills, homework, and dinner while Danielle and her younger brother ran circles around her. It was the look of a woman who was carrying more weight than the world would ever see. The flight attendant, Molly, appeared beside the woman's seat, her expression soft but uncertain. "Ma'am," she began kindly, "is there anything I could do to help?" The woman looked up, embarrassment flashing across her face. "No, thank you," she said quickly, though her voice trembled slightly. "He's just tired. He'll settle down soon." Molly offered her a sympathetic smile before moving on, clearly sensing that the woman's pride would not allow her to accept further help. The cries continued, and Danielle could feel the tension growing in the cabin. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, a few of them throwing disapproving glances toward row 3. Danielle hesitated for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the strap of her bag. It was not her place to step in, she told herself. The woman did not ask for help, and offering it might only make her feel more embarrassed. But as another sharp cry pierced the air, Danielle's instincts overrode her hesitation. She unbuckled her seatbelt and rose quietly, smoothing the front of her blazer as she stepped into the aisle. The murmurs of other passengers grew slightly louder as Danielle moved toward row 3. She could feel their eyes on her, curious and unsure, but she ignored them. The only thing that mattered right now was the woman who looked like she was on the verge of breaking. "Excuse me," Danielle said gently as she stopped beside the seat. Her voice was soft, her tone deliberate. "Would you mind if I helped?" The woman's head shot up in surprise, her dark eyes widening as they met Danielle's calm gaze. She looked both grateful and embarrassed, her cheeks flushing faintly. "Oh no, I don't want to bother you," she stammered, shaking her head quickly. "It's fine. Really?" Danielle offered her a small smile, one that was warm but unwavering. "I promise it's no trouble," she said simply. "I have time, and sometimes another set of hands makes all the difference." For a moment, the woman hesitated, her pride and exhaustion warring within her. Then, finally, she exhaled shakily and nodded, a look of quiet relief passing over her face. "Thank you," she whispered. Danielle knelt slightly to meet the little boy's eye level. He was still squirming, his face red with frustration, but he paused when Danielle offered him a small, gentle smile. "Hey there," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of calm assurance she had used in boardrooms many times before. "What's your name?" The boy blinked up at her, distracted for just a moment. "Carter," he mumbled around a hiccup, his cries softening. "Carter," Danielle repeated, as though his name were the most important thing she had heard all day. "That's a strong name." She reached in her blazer pocket and pulled out a sleek, silver pen. "Do you like to draw, Carter?" The little boy's expression changed, curiosity flickering through his watery eyes. He nodded slowly. Danielle held out the pen to him, her movements calm and careful. "You can hold this for me," she said. "It's my favorite pen, so you'll have to take very good care of it, okay?" Carter reached for the pen with small, chubby fingers, his tears forgotten as his focus shifted entirely to his new treasure. The crying stopped, replaced by the quiet hum of him examining the smooth surface of the pen. The woman, his mother, let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging with visible relief. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice unsteady. "I really appreciate this." Danielle eased back into the aisle, offering her another gentle smile. "You're doing a good job," she said, her voice sincere. "I know it's not easy." The woman's eyes widened slightly, as though she could not believe someone had said those words to her. For a moment, Danielle thought she might cry, but instead, she nodded, her lips pressing together tightly. "Thank you," she said again, this time with more steadiness. Danielle returned to her seat, feeling the curious gazes of other passengers as she passed. She did not meet their eyes, nor did she need to. She had not acted for their approval or acknowledgement. As she settled back in a seat 1A, Molly appeared beside her again, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "That was very kind of you," she said softly, her voice filled with admiration. Danielle shook her head lightly, brushing off the compliment. "It took nothing from me," she replied simply, "and it gave her something she needed." Molly nodded, as though committing those words to memory. "Sometimes that's all it takes," she agreed quietly. Danielle turned her gaze back to the window, where the clouds stretched endlessly below. The golden light was softer now, beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. The woman in row 3 caught her eye once more as she glanced back, Carter now quietly doodling on a napkin with Danielle's pen. The woman gave Danielle a small, grateful smile. It was not grand or overly emotional, but it was real, and it was enough. Danielle leaned back into her seat, her father's words echoing softly in her mind. Kindness creates ripples. How often did people underestimate the impact of small gestures? A kind word, a helping hand, or even just the willingness to stop and notice someone else. It was easy to overlook, but it mattered. It always mattered. Danielle closed her eyes, feeling the hum of the engines beneath her. The world outside was vast and full of noise, but here in the quiet cabin, she had found a small, unexpected moment of connection. She smiled faintly to herself. The ripples were already moving outward, carrying her father's lessons further than he ever could have imagined. The Chicago skyline shimmered through the window of the black sedan as it glided smoothly through the streets. The afternoon sun hung low, casting long golden streaks across the towering glass buildings. Danielle Reed sat quietly in the back seat, her carry-on bag resting beside her and her father's journal tucked carefully inside. The quiet hum of the car's engine mirrored her own steady composure, but her thoughts were elsewhere, still lingering on the small, unexpected moment she had shared on the plane. Carter's quiet smile, the mother's whispered thank you, it was a reminder of how little it took to change the direction of someone's day. Danielle thought about how easy it would have been to keep her head down, to ignore the cries of a restless child and the silent frustration of his mother. But her father's words echoed in her mind. Grace isn't just for when it's easy. It's for when the world is watching. Today, kindness had cost her nothing, and yet, she felt its weight light but significant carried with her now. The car pulled to a smooth stop outside a sleek, modern skyscraper in downtown Chicago. Its glass panels gleamed in the late afternoon light, a symbol of success and power. Danielle stared up at the building for a brief moment before stepping out. She straightened her blazer, adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, and entered the cool, air-conditioned lobby with confident strides. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset, looked up with a practiced smile. "Good afternoon. Welcome to Concord Dynamics. How can I help you?" "Danielle Reed," Danielle replied smoothly. "I have a meeting with the board at 4 o'clock. The woman's eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned on her. "Of course, Ms. Reed. They're expecting you. Please take the elevators to the 35th floor." Danielle nodded politely and made her way across the marble-floored lobby. The air was crisp, filled with the faint hum of conversations and the rhythmic tapping of shoes against polished floors. She entered the elevator, the mirrored walls reflecting her composed expression back at her as the car began its smooth ascent. 35 floors above, the boardroom was already buzzing with quiet energy when Danielle arrived. She could hear the low murmur of voices as she approached, the sound of shifting chairs and muted laughter as executives prepared for the meeting to begin. Stepping through the heavy glass doors, she was greeted by a room filled with familiar faces, some allies, other skeptics. The large oval table stretched before her, lined with board members dressed in sharp suits and polished shoes. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting long shadows across the table's glossy surface. At the head of the table sat Benjamin Tate, the newest member of the board, a man known for his sharp wit and sharper tongue. With his neatly combed silver hair and assessing gaze, Benjamin exuded authority, but Danielle had met men like him before. Men who underestimated her quiet power. She offered the room a polite, professional smile as she approached the empty seat near the center of the table. "Ms. Reed," Benjamin said, his voice carrying just enough warmth to be civil. "It's good to see you again. I trust your flight was comfortable?" Danielle met his gaze evenly, the slightest smile touching her lips. "Thank you, Mr. Tate." It was smooth, though the terminal had its challenges. There was a faint pause, a flicker of something in Benjamin's eyes, perhaps curiosity, but he let the remark pass without further comment. The meeting began, with the agenda unfolding in a practiced rhythm of updates, financial reviews, and strategic discussions. Danielle listened intently, speaking only when necessary, her voice measured and clear. She had always been the kind of leader who preferred to observe first, to understand the room before claiming her space. But she could sense the tension building. Benjamin, in particular, seemed to be watching her closely, waiting for an opportunity to pounce. And then it came. "We need to address our strategy for the Midwest expansion," Benjamin announced, his voice cutting cleanly through the conversation. "There's been some concern about leadership gaps in that region, and frankly, we need someone who can command the room. Someone visible, strong." The word visible hung in the air like a stone thrown into still water. Danielle knew exactly what Benjamin was implying. His eyes flicked toward her, just for a second, before settling on his laptop screen as though the comment had been casual. The room went quiet. Danielle felt the familiar knot of frustration in her chest, the subtle sting of being doubted again. But years of experience had taught her not to react in anger. Instead, she sat up straighter, her gaze steady as she addressed him. "Visibility does not come from shouting the loudest, Mr. Tate," Danielle said, her voice calm and clear. "It comes from leading effectively, from understanding people and building trust. That's how you expand into new markets, not by force, but by respect." A flicker of surprise passed across Benjamin's face, quickly replaced by his usual guarded expression. Around the table, a few board members exchanged subtle nods of agreement. Danielle's words had landed exactly where she intended. "Results speak louder than visibility," she added, folding her hands neatly on the table. "And if you look at the data, you'll see that the Midwest expansion is already gaining traction. Leadership is not lacking, it's evolving." The room remained silent for a beat, the weight of Danielle's words settling over the table. Benjamin leaned back in his chair, his mouth pressed into a thin line, as though reconsidering his earlier comment. "Point taken," he muttered, though his voice had lost some of its earlier edge. Martha Thompson, a seasoned board member who had always been quietly supportive of Danielle, smiled faintly. "Well said, Ms. Reed," she remarked, her tone carrying a note of approval. "Leadership is about setting the tone, not demanding attention." Danielle offered her a polite nod of gratitude, though she did not let her expression waver. The meeting continued, But the shift in the room was palpable. Danielle had once again reminded them of the quiet strength. She carried the kind of strength that did not need to be loud to be felt. When the meeting adjourned an hour later, the board members began to gather their papers and shake hands, the low murmur of conversation filling the room. Benjamin paused briefly as he passed Danielle's seat, his gaze softer now, though still guarded. "Ms. Reed," he said, his voice quieter, "you made your point today. Well done." Danielle regarded him evenly. "Thank you, Mr. Tate. I hope it's clear where the strength of our team lies." Benjamin gave a short nod before moving on, leaving Danielle alone at the table. Martha approached her with a warm smile, her gray hair gleaming in the sunlight. "You have always had a way of turning doubt into conviction, Danielle," Martha said. "It's a rare gift." Danielle smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders finally beginning to ease. "Sometimes you just have to remind people who you are." Martha's smile deepened. "And who you are, Danielle Reed, is exactly what this company needs." As Danielle left the boardroom and stepped into the quiet hallway, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not because she had won, but because she had stayed true to herself. Her father's voice echoed softly in her mind once more. "Hold your head high always." She pressed the elevator button, feeling the hum of victory settle into her bones. This, she thought, was how you moved forward, not by shouting, not by fighting, but by showing up, standing firm, and letting your actions speak. As the elevator doors opened, Danielle stepped inside, her reflection staring back at her from the mirrored walls. She looked composed, confident, a woman who had earned every bit of the respect she demanded. And she knew, deep down, that she would always rise to meet whatever came next. The sun was sinking low by the time Danielle Reed returned to her hotel suite, painting the Chicago skyline in hues of orange and pink. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows stretched endlessly, the city alive with its flickering lights and busy streets far below. But inside the suite, the quiet was a stark contrast, so still that it amplified the hum of her thoughts. Danielle set her leather carry-on down gently near the small desk by the window and slipped off her heels. She let out a slow, measured breath as the weight of the day began to settle. The board meeting had been a victory of sorts, a reminder to herself and others that her quiet power could command a room without raising her voice. But victory, as always, felt like a temporary pause in an endless journey. She poured herself a glass of water from the small carafe on the table and sat on the edge of the bed, her gaze drifting to her carry-on. The journal was still inside, tucked safely away like a secret. Her father's words were etched in her mind, their wisdom still guiding her after all these years. Grace and strength. Show them both. As Danielle stared at the dimming horizon, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated for a moment, debating whether to let it go to voicemail. The exhaustion in her bones was real, and the last thing she needed was another work-related call. But something compelled her to answer. "Hello," she said, her tone calm but guarded. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a shaky breath. "Ms. Reed." The voice was hesitant, uncertain. It was young, feminine. Danielle frowned slightly. "Yes, this is Danielle Reed." "Who's calling?" It's Samantha," the voice replied softly. "From the airport." Danielle's brow furrowed as the name clicked into place. Samantha Banks, the smug young woman from the service counter. The one whose mockery had been as sharp as her disinterest. Danielle's initial instinct was to hang up, to dismiss the call the same way Samantha had dismissed her earlier. But something in the girl's voice stopped her. It sounded fragile, unsure, like someone trying to find steady ground after a fall. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Samantha added quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I just wanted to apologize." Danielle paused, choosing her response carefully. "Go on." On the other end, Samantha let out another shaky breath. "What happened this morning, what I said, the way I treated you, it wasn't right. I was rude, and I judged you without knowing anything about you. I didn't," her voice faltered. "I didn't realize how ugly it was until I thought back on it." Danielle closed her eyes for a moment, leaning back slightly as she processed the words. Apologies like this were rare, especially when they were genuine. She knew from experience that people often doubled down on their mistakes, blaming others instead of looking inward. But this was different. You didn't realize, Danielle repeated softly, her tone even. What made you realize it now? There was silence for a beat before Samantha spoke again, her voice quieter. It was the way you handled it, she admitted. You didn't yell. You didn't lose your composure. You just made that call, and everything changed. I've never seen someone do that before. I guess it made me look at myself. Danielle let the words hang in the air. She could hear the discomfort in Samantha's voice, the way it cracked with shame and uncertainty. The girl was grappling with the weight of her own actions, and Danielle could sense how much that realization unsettled her. Why are you calling me, Samantha? Danielle asked finally, her tone gentle but firm. What do you hope to gain from this conversation? I don't know, Samantha replied honestly. I needed to say I'm sorry. I needed you to hear it, and I don't want to be that kind of person anymore. Danielle looked out the window at the sprawling city below. She thought of her younger self, the woman who had stood in so many rooms where she did not feel welcome. She remembered the hurt of being dismissed, the quiet ache of being underestimated time and time again. And yet, she had learned to rise above it not just for herself, but for the people who would come after her. Her father's words echoed softly in her mind. Teach them, even when they don't deserve it. Grace is as much for you as it is for them. Samantha, Danielle said finally, her voice steady. It's not enough to say you're sorry. Words are easy. Change is harder. What matters is what you do next. I know, Samantha whispered. I want to do better. I'm going to talk to HR. I asked for more training today, and I want to learn. I know I can't take back what I did, but I can try to be better. Danielle's grip on the phone loosened slightly as she absorbed the girl's words. There was hesitation in Samantha's voice, but there was sincerity, too. It was small, but it was a beginning. You're young, Danielle said after a pause. Mistakes are part of life, but what defines you is how you grow from them. Samantha's breath hitched, as though the words struck deeper than she expected. Thank you, she said softly, for not hanging up, for listening. I listened because I believe people can change, Danielle replied, but only if they're willing to do the work. Do not waste this moment, Samantha. It can be a turning point if you let it. I won't, Samantha said quickly, her voice stronger now. I promise. Danielle nodded to herself, though the girl on the other end could not see it. Good, she said simply. Take care of yourself, Samantha. You too, Ms. Reed, Samantha replied, her voice quieter once more. And thank you. Really? The line went silent, and Danielle lowered the phone slowly, setting it on the nightstand. She sat still for a moment, letting the conversation settle into her thoughts. It would be easy to dismiss Samantha's apology, to assume it was fleeting or insincere. But Danielle had spent too much of her life being doubted to do the same to someone else. If there was even a chance that Samantha could change, that she could learn to treat others with more kindness, then maybe today had been more than just another battle. Maybe it had been a ripple, a small push that would carry further than Danielle could see. Rising from the bed, Danielle walked over to the window, the sprawling city stretching far into the distance. She thought of the mother in row 3, of Molly's quiet attentiveness, and now of Samantha's call. Kindness and growth, Danielle realized, often started small, but small moments could still matter. She reached for her father's journal and opened it to a blank page, pen in hand. Today reminded me of something important. Kindness is not weakness. Grace can be the strongest tool we have. And sometimes, growth begins where we least expect it. She closed the journal and set it carefully back on the desk, her father's words still guiding her, as they always had. Danielle turned her gaze back to the city one last time, watching as the last light of day slipped below the horizon, giving way to the soft glow of evening. The world was full of challenges, she knew that better than most. But it was also full of moments like these. Moments where people could learn. Moments where people could change. And Danielle Reed, as always, would face them with the same quiet strength that had carried her this far. The next morning, the city of Chicago greeted Danielle Reed with a crisp, cool breeze and a golden sunrise that spilled over the glass skyscrapers like liquid light. Standing near the window of her hotel suite, she watched the world stir to life. People bustled on the streets below, cars weaved through traffic, and the steady hum of the city vibrated through the air. Danielle held a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, the warmth seeping through the porcelain and into her fingertips. She was usually indifferent to hotel coffee, always too strong or too weak, but this morning, she welcomed it. It anchored her. It gave her a moment of stillness before the day began. The phone call from Samantha still lingered in her mind. The girl's voice, full of shame and determination, had been unexpected. Danielle had heard apologies before, many of them empty, designed to smooth over discomfort rather than address the core issue. But Samantha's had been different. The young woman had looked inward, and that, Danielle knew, was the hardest step of all. Small ripples, she whispered to herself, her father's words once again echoing softly in her mind. The ripple effect, how one moment, one choice, could extend far beyond what anyone could see. It was not the apology itself that mattered, but what Samantha would do with it. And though Danielle might never see the outcome, the possibility of change was enough to carry her forward. She turned from the window, her mind already focused on the charity luncheon she would be attending later that day. The event was close to her heart, an annual gathering for underprivileged youth, providing scholarships, mentorship programs, and hope for those who needed it most. Danielle had been a keynote speaker at the luncheon for the past 3 years, sharing her own story of resilience and quiet strength. Today, though, something felt different. Maybe it was Samantha's call. Maybe it was the memory of the woman in row 3 and her restless child. Or maybe it was Molly, the flight attendant who had reminded Danielle that kindness was not a grand performance, but a series of small, intentional actions. Whatever it was, Danielle felt the weight of her words more than ever as she slipped into a navy dress and matching blazer, her movements deliberate. She clipped a pair of simple pearl earrings into place and stood before the mirror, her reflection calm and composed. "You belong here," she whispered softly to herself. It was not a reassurance, it was a truth. By noon, the ballroom of the downtown Chicago hotel buzzed with quiet energy. Round tables covered in white linen stretched across the room, decorated with simple centerpieces of fresh flowers. The soft murmur of conversations filled the space as attendees mingled, business leaders, educators, and young students who had come to celebrate the opportunities created by the scholarship program. Danielle arrived alone, her entrance quiet but unmistakable. Heads turned as she crossed the room, her presence commanding without her having to say a word. She greeted colleagues and familiar faces with polite warmth, but her attention was drawn to the tables near the back, where the scholarship recipients sat. Young faces full of promise and nervous energy turned toward her, some watching with open admiration, others shyly averting their gazes. "Ms. Reed," a voice called softly behind her. Danielle turned to find Claire Hughes, the program coordinator, approaching with a bright smile. Claire was a woman in her mid-40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She had been running the program for years, pouring her heart into its success. "Claire," Danielle said warmly, shaking her hand, "it's good to see you again." "Likewise," Claire replied, her smile genuine. "We're so glad you could join us today. Your speech always leaves such an impression on the kids." Danielle nodded thoughtfully. "The work you're doing here changes lives. I'm grateful to be a part of it." Claire's smile softened. "Speaking of, there's someone I'd like you to meet before the luncheon starts." She gestured to a nearby table, where a young woman sat quietly, her hands folded nervously in her lap. "That's Maria Gomez. She's this year's top scholarship recipient." Danielle followed Claire's gaze and studied the young woman at the table. Maria couldn't have been more than 18, with dark, shoulder-length hair and eyes that carried the quiet determination of someone who had fought hard for every step forward. She was dressed in a simple blouse and skirt that seemed just slightly too big, as though borrowed for the occasion. Claire leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Maria's had a tough year. Her father passed away, and her mother works 2 jobs to keep the family afloat. But she's top of her class, and she plans to study engineering. She's got the kind of grit I know you appreciate." Danielle's expression softened. "Let's go say hello." As they approached, Maria looked up quickly, her eyes widening as Claire introduced Danielle. "Maria, This is Ms. Reed, our keynote speaker, and one of the program's biggest supporters." Maria stood abruptly, nearly knocking over her chair in her haste. "Ms. Reed," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "it's such an honor to meet you." Danielle smiled gently and extended her hand. "The honor is mine, Maria. Claire tells me you've worked very hard to be here." Maria nodded, swallowing nervously. "I just want to make something of myself, to show my mom that all her sacrifices were worth it." Danielle's gaze softened, and for a moment, she saw herself in the young woman's eyes. She remembered being 18, carrying the weight of her family's dreams on her shoulders. "You're already making something of yourself," Danielle said firmly. "And this is just the beginning. Keep working hard, keep believing in yourself, and no door will stay closed to you." Maria's eyes glistened faintly as she nodded, her lips pressing into a tight but grateful smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Danielle placed a hand gently on Maria's shoulder. "You belong in every room you walk into. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." As she walked back toward the front of the room, Danielle's mind turned over the interaction. Maria's quiet strength reminded her of all the young people who carried more weight than the world ever saw. She thought of Samantha, of the ripple that had started with one small moment of accountability. And she thought of Maria, another ripple just beginning. By the time Danielle took the stage for her speech, the room had quieted, the soft hum of conversation fading into stillness. She looked out at the faces before her, executives, educators, and most importantly, the students who sat at the back, their wide eyes fixed on her. Danielle adjusted the microphone and began. "I stand here today because someone believed in me when I wasn't sure I could believe in myself." She started, her voice calm and clear. "I was once a young woman like many of you, walking into rooms where I felt like I didn't belong. But what I learned, what I want you to carry with you is this. Your worth is not defined by others' assumptions. You are stronger, braver, and more capable than you know." The room remained still as her words resonated. "Kindness and strength are not weaknesses," Danielle continued. "They're your greatest tools. They will help you open doors, lift others up, and create change ripples that will move farther than you can see." Her gaze found Maria in the back of the room, the young woman's eyes shining with hope. "Whatever challenges you face, remember this. You belong here. In every room, at every table, you belong." The applause that followed was soft at first, then grew louder, echoing through the ballroom like the affirmation of a shared truth. Danielle stepped back from the microphone, her heart steady, knowing that she had planted something in those students, something small but lasting. As she left the stage, Claire met her with a beaming smile. "You always know exactly what to say," she said. Danielle shook her head slightly, smiling back. "I just tell them what I wish someone had told me." Claire nodded knowingly. "And that's why it matters." Outside the ballroom, the afternoon light poured through the windows, golden and unbroken. Danielle paused by the exit, feeling the weight of the moment settle gently on her shoulders. She knew she would not see where all the ripples landed, but that did not matter. Change began small, one kind act, one young woman, one room at a time. And that was enough. The quiet hum of the city outside Danielle's hotel suite was a distant murmur as she set down her leather carry-on bag near the window. Evening had descended on Chicago, and the world outside twinkled with the steady glow of street lights and distant car headlights, weaving through the veins of the city. Danielle slipped off her blazer, draping it carefully over the back of the chair near the small desk. She poured herself a glass of water, the sound of the liquid filling the silence like a soft ripple. The charity luncheon earlier still echoed in her mind, the faces of the young students, Maria's nervous but hopeful voice, and the applause that had followed her words. She lowered herself into the armchair by the window, her reflection faintly visible against the glass. For a moment, she studied herself. The years had given her wisdom, strength, and calm, but sometimes in quiet moments like these, she still saw traces of the young woman she had once been, eager, uncertain, carrying the weight of proving herself to a world that had underestimated her. Her phone buzzed on the small side table, pulling her from her thoughts. Danielle glanced at the screen. It was a text from Claire Hughes, the program coordinator from the luncheon. "Claire, Maria wanted me to pass along her thanks again. She said your words gave her courage. She's already drafting her engineering school applications." Danielle's lips curved into a small, thoughtful smile as she read the message. Courage. A simple word, yet it held so much weight. It was something Danielle had learned to cultivate over the years: courage to show up, courage to demand respect, courage to keep moving forward even when the world made it difficult. She set the phone down and leaned back into the chair, letting her mind drift. Small ripples. That was what today had been about. Samantha's phone call, the mother in row 3, Maria and her quiet determination. It had all tied together, threads weaving into something larger. Danielle had once believed change had to come in sweeping, dramatic movements, but she had learned over time that real change often began in the smallest of moments. Her father's words came to her again, soft and clear as if he were sitting beside her. Sometimes, the ripples we create become waves we'll never see. With a quiet sigh, Danielle reached for her carry-on, pulling out the leather journal. She opened it to the next blank page, the familiar scent of the paper grounding her. Clicking her pen softly, she paused, letting the calm of the room surround her. Then she began to write. Today, I was reminded of the power of connection. A phone call from someone who once mocked me, but now wants to change. A mother on a plane who needed a moment of kindness. A young woman, full of promise, whose path will carry her far beyond what she imagines. These moments remind me that kindness, strength, and grace have a ripple effect, one that can outlast our understanding. Danielle paused, the tip of her pen hovering over the page. She thought back to Samantha's apology the night before, to the tremor in her voice as she admitted her mistakes. It would have been easy for Danielle to dismiss her, to let Samantha sit with the weight of her actions. And perhaps she still deserved that weight. But Danielle's father had taught her that grace, when given to those willing to change, could be transformative. Her pen moved again. I believe people can change. Not always, but sometimes. And in those rare moments when someone sees their flaws and decides to do better, we owe it to them and to ourselves to give them the space to grow. Not for their comfort, but for their evolution. Change begins with a single decision. She set the pen down, the weight of her thoughts resting gently on her shoulders. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, a patchwork of lights glowing against the dark sky. Somewhere, she thought, Samantha might still be grappling with what had happened. Somewhere, Maria was sitting at her desk, poring over her scholarship applications with the determination of someone who knew she could make it. Danielle closed the journal softly and leaned back in the chair, her gaze drifting to the window once more. Her father's lessons had shaped her into the woman she was. His unwavering belief in grace and strength, his insistence that she would need both to navigate the world. He had taught her to hold her head high, to walk into every room as though she belonged there, even when others doubted her presence. The weight of those lessons settled deeper tonight. They were more than words on a page or echoes in her mind. They were her armor. A faint knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She stood, smoothing the front of her dress before opening it. A young bellhop stood there, holding a small bouquet of white lilies wrapped neatly in brown paper. "These are for you, ma'am," he said, holding them out with a polite smile. Danielle frowned slightly in surprise, but took the flowers carefully. "Thank you," she said softly, handing him a small tip before closing the door. Setting the bouquet on the desk, she noticed a small card nestled among the blooms. She unfolded it slowly, recognizing the careful, neat handwriting. "Thank you for reminding me that mistakes can be lessons. I won't waste this one." "Samantha!" Danielle stared at the note for a long moment, her chest tightening with something she could not quite name. Samantha's words were simple, but they carried the weight of sincerity. Change was rarely immediate. It was slow, deliberate, and often uncomfortable. But here was proof that a small ripple had begun, and with it hope. Danielle placed the note gently on the desk and leaned against the edge, her arms folding across her chest as she studied the bouquet. The lilies were fresh and vibrant, their soft petals reaching upward toward the light as though stretching toward something greater. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was another message, this time from her assistant. Assistant. Board meeting follow-up. Everyone praised your leadership yesterday. Mr. Tate especially said he learned a lot. Your impact is growing. Danielle let out a quiet breath, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Growth, whether in others or herself, was never linear. It was filled with stops, starts, and lessons that lingered long after the moment had passed. She sat down at the desk once more, fingers lightly brushing over Samantha's note and the edge of her father's journal. Small ripples, she thought again. Perhaps she would never see where they landed, but knowing they had begun was enough. Her gaze drifted back to the window, with a city stretched out in all directions, a city full of people, stories, and possibilities. Somewhere, those ripples would touch lives she would never know, and that was what made the work worth it. Danielle allowed herself one last deep breath, the quiet of the suite settling over her like a soft blanket. Her father's words returned to her, gentle and steady. Grace creates the space for change, even when the world resists it. She whispered the words aloud to herself, as though to let them settle deeper into her heart. Grace creates the space for change. Outside, the city glimmered with life, and Danielle Reed sat quietly at the desk, her thoughts calm and her purpose clear. Tomorrow would come, and with it, new challenges, new moments, and new ripples waiting to begin. And Danielle would rise, as she always had, ready to meet it all with strength and grace. The early morning light crept through the sheer curtains of the hotel suite, spilling softly across the room. The city of Chicago was beginning to wake its steady rhythm of life, humming quietly in the background. Birds chirped faintly somewhere beyond the glass, mingling with the sound of traffic far below. Danielle Reed opened her eyes slowly, taking in the quiet stillness. She stretched briefly, letting her limbs shake off the weight of sleep, and sat upright on the edge of the bed. For a moment, she simply sat there, feeling the peace of the new day. The tension of the past days, first the airport confrontation, then the boardroom challenges, and the ripples that followed felt further away now, as though she had stepped beyond them. She rose, her movement steady, and walked to the window. The skyline spread out before her, streaks of gold and pink shimmering off the mirrored skyscrapers. It was a new day, bright and full of possibility. Danielle watched the light shift as it touched the streets below. The world carried on, unaware of the small victories that had unfolded in its corners the day before. But to her, those moments mattered. She turned back to her desk, where her father's leather journal lay waiting. Beside it, the small note from Samantha, carefully folded, still sat next to the now slightly wilted white lilies. Danielle picked up the note and ran her thumb lightly across the edge of the paper, the young woman's words lingering in her thoughts. I won't waste this one. People could surprise you, she thought. Change was hard, but not impossible. Samantha's apology and her willingness to act on it had been a small reminder that even those who stumbled could stand up again. Sometimes, they just needed someone to show them the way. Danielle tucked the note into her journal, where it would remain a quiet reminder of the ripple effect her actions had set in motion. She gathered her belongings, packing her carry-on with deliberate care. Each item was placed with the precision of someone who had done this countless time before, her routines as steady as her mindset. When the bag was zipped and her blazer neatly pulled on, Danielle took one last look around the suite. The space was immaculate now, empty of her presence, but holding the residue of the thoughts and lessons that had settled here. She made her way to the hotel lobby, where the air buzzed faintly with morning energy. Guests checked out. Employees greeted one another with the quiet familiarity of a new workday, and the sound of shoes clicking across the polished floors reminded Danielle of the hum of the airport 2 mornings ago. Only this time, her thoughts were clear, steady. The driver was waiting for her outside, the black sedan idling quietly at the curb. He stepped forward as soon as he saw her, offering a polite nod as he opened the door. "Good morning, Ms. Reed." "Good morning," Danielle replied softly, her voice carrying the calm assurance of someone who was prepared for the day ahead. The car door closed with a faint thud, shutting out the hum of the street. Inside, the soft scent of leather and the muted sound of the engine surrounded her. As they pulled away from the curb, Danielle let her gaze drift to the streets of Chicago one last time. The sidewalks were alive with people moving quickly, coffee in hand, bags slung over shoulders, all of them walking forward into their own small stories. Her phone buzzed in her bag, pulling her attention back to the present. Danielle reached for it and glanced at the screen. It was a message from her assistant, short but purposeful. Assistant, morning update. Samantha officially started her HR-led training today. She asked to volunteer with customer service outreach next week. Thought you'd like to know. Danielle's lips curved into a faint smile, something warm and knowing settling in her chest. Samantha had chosen to move forward, not perfectly, not without effort, but with intention. It was a small step, but small steps mattered. She leaned back into the seat, letting the car's smooth rhythm carry her thoughts forward. Change didn't happen in a single moment. It was built slowly, with care, like a ripple spreading across still water. She knew that now. Every action, every word, every bit of kindness, no matter how small, could reach places you could never see. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a brief message from Claire Hughes. Claire, Maria submitted her first engineering application last night. Her mom cried happy tears. Just thought you want to know you inspired her. Danielle exhaled slowly, the smile lingering on her face. Maria's journey reminded her of her own younger self, the girl who had once carried her family's hopes on her back. She had stumbled plenty along the way, but the people who had shown her kindness, who had lifted her up when she needed it, had made all the difference. And now, Danielle was that person for someone else. The car glided into the airport drop-off lane, the flow of travelers moving steadily along the curb. Danielle's driver stepped out to open her door. As she climbed out of the sedan, the crisp morning air greeted her, cool and refreshing against her skin. Inside, the terminal was alive with its usual hum of chaos, families hurrying toward security, the click of suitcases on tile, flight announcements echoing through the space. Danielle navigated through it with the ease of someone who belonged. She approached the first-class check-in counter, where a young man with a neat uniform and a polite smile greeted her. Good morning, ma'am. How can I assist you today? Danielle Reed, she replied, handing over her ID and ticket. Of course, Ms. Reed, he said smoothly as he typed into the system. We're glad to have you flying with us today. There was no condescension in his voice, no smug assumptions, no barriers to break through, just professionalism and respect. Danielle felt a small weight lift, though she knew moments like these were not always guaranteed. As she made her way to the gate, she found herself watching the people around her, business travelers, families, students with backpacks slung over their shoulders. Each person was walking their own path, carrying their own unseen struggles. She wondered, briefly, how many of them might be just one small kindness away from a turning point. Boarding was called, and Danielle stepped onto the plane, the flight attendants greeting her with warm smiles. She settled into her first-class seat, placing her carry-on gently in the overhead bin before sinking into the plush cushion. The cabin was calm, a quiet bubble of luxury away from the noise outside. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Danielle leaned back and closed her eyes. The hum of the engines began to swell, steady and familiar, as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. Outside the window, the world blurred until the plane lifted into the sky, the city below shrinking away. Danielle stared out at the clouds stretching endlessly in all directions. The view always gave her perspective how vast the world was, how small any single moment might feel, and yet how powerful it could be. Her father's voice echoed softly in her mind one last time. Strength and grace will carry you forward. Keep moving, even when the world doubts you. Danielle whispered the words to herself, as though offering them to the skies. Keep moving. As the plane climbed higher, she let herself relax, her thoughts quiet and content. She had faced the challenges of yesterday, and tomorrow would bring new ones. But she was ready for them. She always would be. The ripple she created through kindness, strength, and quiet power would continue spreading, reaching places she might never see. And that was enough. Outside her window, the sun broke through the clouds, a brilliant streak of gold painting the horizon. It was a new day, and Danielle Reed was ready to meet it. The plane soared high above the clouds, leaving the city of Chicago far behind. Danielle Reed leaned back in her seat, watching the sunlight spill across the horizon, streaking the endless sky in hues of gold. Her reflection faintly stared back at her in the small, oval window, calm and resolute, a reminder of who she had become and how far she had come. Her thoughts drifted to the ripples of the past few days, the tense encounter at the airport, the quiet moments of connection with strangers like Maria, and even Samantha's unexpected call. Each experience had served as a small but powerful reminder that kindness and grace could create waves of change, no matter how subtle. Life was full of battles, both big and small, but Danielle had learned to meet them all the same way, with dignity, strength, and unwavering determination. As she looked out at the vast stretch of clouds below, she whispered the words that carried her forward every day. Keep moving, because no matter the challenge, no matter the obstacle, Danielle knew the power of quiet resilience. And as the sun broke brighter across the sky, she smiled faintly, knowing that her actions, however small, might inspire someone else to rise, to change, and to believe in their own strength. If you were inspired by Danielle's story of quiet strength, grace, and perseverance, remember this: the smallest acts of kindness can make the biggest difference. It only takes one moment, one choice, to start a ripple that can change someone's life. If you love stories of resilience, growth, and justice, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales like this one. And do not forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that could move or inspire you. Let us know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed a small act of kindness create a ripple of change? Your stories matter, and they can inspire others too. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one. Keep moving forward.